Hello and welcome to Chapter 3, Ethical Issues in the Conduct of Psychological Research for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, which will be broken up into two presentations, we're going to give you an overview of ethical issues in the conduct of research with human subjects, as well as with non-human participants. And we'll be focusing our attention on, what are the costs and benefits of participation, and how do we make decisions as good researchers about the kinds of procedures that we select in an ethical context. Now, I like the way your authors start out this chapter by talking about what does good science require. Because sometimes for students, when they've not conducted research of their own, they're not accustomed to thinking about their research in a moral or ethical context. You may have, you've read textbooks certainly at this point, and all of your textbooks in your intro course or your other 200 level courses, they're made up of just long lists of research findings. So you understand that research happens. But what you don't have a good background on is what is going on behind the scenes in terms of why people are making the decisions that they make. Some of you asked questions about the research described in one of the earlier chapters concerning video game violence or media violence and its impact potentially on human behavior. And you are right to ask those questions. One of the reasons researchers use such artificial methodology in collecting data of that kind is because of ethical considerations. We can't ethically put participants in a position where they might be harmed by other people. And if we went the other direction and said, well, we're going to do it naturalistically, we're going to observe, you would have a duty as a human being with morality to intervene if you knew someone was going to come to harm. So we're often very limited by in terms of the questions we can ask and the techniques that we can use by these moral considerations. And that's not a complaint. It's a perfectly appropriate reaction. So your authors start with this idea of what does good science require. The number one thing first is that when you do good work, when you do good research, you do research competently. I remember very specifically when I was in graduate school, a study was done by a group of grad students who really just did not think through what they were doing. Their design was flawed from the start. The logic of their question was flawed from the start. I don't know how it got through the institutional review board to give them permission to do what they wanted to do, but it became notorious as an example of just incompetently conducted research. God will spare you the details, but in University of Nebraska psychology department lore, it's gone down as the, quote, Halloween study. You can ask me for details in another context if you'd like. So your first responsibility is to be a competent, well-trained researcher and to follow the basic rules of good science in doing your work. Good science also requires that you, as a member of a community of scientists, have to participate in that culture. So you're not doing reporting. You're also not doing literature. You're not writing fiction. You have to report your results accurately. And that includes results that are not consistent with what you hypothesized. You also have to, as you're doing research, particularly but not exclusively, if you have grant-funded research, if you have paid employees, even if they're student employees, if you have students who are working for you in your lab for course credit, you have to manage those resources with honesty and appropriateness. So for example, you can't give a student course credit for working in your lab to collect data when in fact they've collected no data. That would be unethical and dishonest. If you get a grant from say, a government organization, and they are paying for equipment, or they are paying salaries or licenses and so on, but you don't use the money for that purpose, number one, you're going to be charged with a violation of law, but number two, you'll never get funding from that organization again because you violated the ethical principles of managing resources honestly. You also have to, again, this is about being a member of a community of scientists. We have to work together in order to move scientific knowledge forward. So we have to be honest about who has contributed and in what particular way to every piece of research that we conduct. So when we communicate scientifically, and what your authors mean by that is if we're published, if we present in a public forum, even if I take a piece of research that's unpublished and I mention it on a blog post, I need to disclose the other people who were involved in that work. And that includes student researchers. I try very much to include, not necessarily as authors, that depends on their level of contribution, but if I've had students who collected data, who did a pilot study, I mention those contributions in pieces of work that I've done. In a more straightforward sense, good science requires that you think through the consequences to the broader world around you of the research that you're conducting. Are there going to be positive impacts? Could there be negative impacts of what you are studying, how you're studying it, and what you might find out to be true? And it's not saying that, you know, there's no inherent value to asking and answering questions that you're just curious about. But being a good citizen of the world of science means that you are going to think through the consequences and weigh the costs and benefits of those issues before you conduct the research, not after. So doing good science is not a situation where you do what you have to do and you apologize later. That's not good science. And that's not being a good citizen of the community of scholars that embrace the scientific ethic. Finally, doing good science requires that you as a researcher, and you can see lots of examples of this if you follow white papers that come out of the American Psychological Association, for example, or the American Psychological Society. Both of these national organizations, if there are issues of social concern that are connected to what, as a community of scientists, researchers know, then there's a responsibility to speak out. For example, in Supreme Court cases over the years, when the opinion of psychological science is believed to matter, the APA will often submit what's called an amicus brief to inform the justices of their opinion. In other contexts, one really useful example was when the APA, the American Psychological Association, had to really come to a reckoning and make a statement about the involvement of psychologists, clinical psychologists, in the system of interrogation used in Guantanamo Bay. There had been a lot of criticism of psychologists and their involvement in that work in Guantanamo, and the APA eventually, it took a while for them to come to this conclusion, but they eventually did make a statement and come out publicly that they were opposed on ethical and moral grounds to the participation of psychologists in the process of interrogation through the military. Now, I've mentioned the American Psychological Association already. The APA Code of Ethics is broad. It doesn't include just research. It includes all of the areas in which psychological training may be applied to a career path. So the APA in creating a code of ethics, which is updated periodically every few years. It covers researchers, and that includes students. So by proxy, if I have students working in my lab, working on my projects, I have to be responsible for ensuring that they behave ethically and appropriately. Clinicians and counselors, anyone who's in applied practice in an allied field, they also have written into the ethics code responsibilities to behave ethically. Also teachers, people like me who are professors, and administrators. They are all adherent to the code of ethics. And across the field, regardless of whether you are a clinician, a counselor, or not in that applied wing of the field, there are still ethical standards that you have to uphold. The purpose of the ethics code, which you should be familiar with from taking PSY 120, the professional development course. There's a whole module on the ethics code where you're encouraged to really kind of look at the elements of the code, not in a great deal of detail, but to familiarize yourself with the aspects of the ethics code. But the global purpose is to give psychologists in their various capacities guidelines to follow in order to make ethical decisions. In some cases, the ethics code is consistent with, and then, kind of follows on two tracks with other state and federal legislation. In other cases, it goes beyond that and establishes, rules and structure for both scientists and non-scientists in their work. Now, I mentioned before that it's essential that before you conduct research of any kind, that you evaluate the ethical issues that are associated with the project that you're thinking of doing. One way that psychologists and other social scientists and other researchers who use human beings as participants are held accountable in terms of their ethics review is by interacting with what's called an institutional review board. Now, we haven't always had institutional review boards, and historically speaking, they're a relatively recent phenomenon. To give you the very short, truncated version of the history, IRBs, or their similarly named counterparts, were an outgrowth of some really intense introspection, both in starting in the medical community. After World War II, it was determined, and I don't want you to think this is strictly an artifact of the Nazi system, but there was a great deal of public acknowledgement that medical research was conducted on interred people during the Holocaust. So people who were Jews, people who were disabled, people who were gay or lesbian, and so on. Anyone in the death camps could be experimented on without obviously their permission or consent. So there was a lot of public discourse and concern over that. And as I said, this isn't just an artifact of the Nazi system. There were examples of this kind of using human beings as research subjects in medical research pretty much anywhere where medical science was being studied. So there was an international conversation about the establishment of ethics rules and review, external review, which included non-professionals who were looking at research projects with the eye of not a medical scientist, but instead a regular person, or a person of faith, or a person with outside expertise. So it was determined that there had to be that kind of oversight. And when scientists overstepped, they were told no, and they could not conduct their research. If they couldn't justify that the benefits of doing the research outweighed the costs, to potential participants and to society, then their research was not permitted to go forward. So when we think about what IRBs do, and IRBs, including the IRB at the University of Mount Union, which has been around since, I believe, 1995, which may surprise you, but for many small universities, it's been a relatively recent phenomenon to have an IRB on your campus. But it is required. You know, anywhere if you're in an institution that accepts federal money, and that includes federal grants or federal student loans and a whole range of other federal resources, you must have internal review, institutional review board oversight of research operations. So we have an IRB, and its job is to look out for the rights and welfare of human participants in research. There's a separate body, and we'll talk about it in a second here, for non-human subjects. What the board does is review every piece of research that would involve human participants and make judgments about either approving it, disapproving the project, or requiring modifications of the research plan. We take this, you know, in psychology, neuroscience, and human development, we ask that all of our students conduct an SCE research project in a team environment. And an important part of that process is learning how to construct an IRB proposal, where you show that you have evaluated the risks and benefits of your work, and you have submitted a proposal that will be read by, in our case, several faculty from multiple departments, some from psych, some not. We have, I think, in the current composition, some folks from a variety of social sciences, as well as people from the I believe athletic training and sports medicine, and I believe there's someone from nursing. You'd have to fact check me on that. But there are also outside members, individuals from the community who are not affiliated with the university, who look at research proposals from students and from faculty. What they are charged with doing is reviewing all proposals, regardless of who they're from, faculty, students, staff, and consider the point of view of the various parties who are involved, the school, the researcher, and the participants, in deciding what kind of outcome and what kind of feedback to give. IRBs by law, and this is by federal law, have to have at least 5 members, and they have to vary in background. So I won't bore you with the details of the criteria, but you have to have a certain minimum complement of people from different disciplines. And basically the purpose of that is so that you have, multiple perspectives on research. If you have a medical school, for example, and your entire IRB is made up of medical school faculty, it's kind of an inside job, right? You're not really fulfilling that requirement of IRBs being objective and multivocal, that you have more than one perspective looking at the costs and benefits of a particular methodology or procedure. Now, I mentioned that there's a separate body that looks over the use of non-human subjects in research. Any research has to have the ethics evaluated before conducting it. That includes when you're using laboratory animals and from a variety of species. The body that makes those decisions is called an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC for short. Having looked at some of the manuals, I have to say that the manual for the IACUC and the materials that go along with it is actually more substantial than the one for humans. Humans have the ability, if you're talking about adults, to form opinions, to make judgments, and especially to give you consent. Non-human subjects can't do that. So this adorable little red-eyed rat that you see on the screen, you can't ask that rat, dude, do you really want to submit to having induced brain damage? The rat will just look at you and say, where are my pellets? So you can't get consent from a rat or a rhesus macaque or a turtle or whatever. You have to make those judgments and do so in a moral and ethical way. And the IACUC is designed to help with that process. So the IACUC is tasked with, just like with the IRB, but in this case, protecting the rights and welfare of animal subjects, and that includes their general care. So if you have in your laboratory, and you're using primarily for teaching purposes, Dr. Muller used to, in her learning class, get rats every year, and students were assigned a rat. They worked in teams and they did training exercises with the rat. Technically, IACUC, even though these are not research subjects, they were used for an educational purpose in a laboratory environment, and therefore there are standards that have to be upheld, and it would be the IACUC that has some degree of oversight over the care, the appropriate care, the cleanliness, the food, the bedding, the water, making sure everything is clean, up to and including is the HVAC system up to the task of keeping the air clean such that these animals will not have negative health impacts. Just as another, aside, the room where we were keeping our rats, over the decade or so since the building was remodeled to include that laboratory, IACUC standards, and not so much IACUC standards, but FDA standards, Food and Drug Administration standards, kind of shifted to a more stringent approach to the HVAC rules for housing laboratory rats and mice, such that upgrades were going to have to be made to that space in order to maintain a colony of rats. So I give you that example just to note that it's not just using them in research, it's also their overall care and the oversight of that care in an academic department or in a research laboratory and so on. My daughter, for example, my oldest, worked in a cancer lab when she was a student at Ohio State. They had mice that they used in genetic modeling for cancer research on melanoma, and they maintain a breeding colony. So even when a particular group of mice is present in the lab, even if those mice themselves are not subjects in a given round of experimentation, the colony is being maintained as a part of that research project. There are health and safety rules, there are housing and maintenance rules, there are health checks and veterinary checks and so on that have to be done in order to keep that lab running in an ethical manner. IACUC committees are expected to include, at a minimum, one person who is a scientist with some exposure to the use of animal subjects. Rather, a veterinarian has to be involved, and it's typically a local veterinarian who will stand as sort of the medical expert for the IACUC, and then at least one person who's not connected to the institution. And that's the case with the Mount Union IACUC. As I said before, care and housing, that includes feeding and veterinary care, is all part of the consideration as part of the work of the IACUC. Sorry, I clicked too early again. The real teeth of whether you're looking at human subjects, human participants, or animal subjects, before you conduct research, what you're really focusing your attention on is the risk-benefit analysis. So regardless of who your participants are, humans or non-humans, you're going to do this ethical analysis in order to assess the degree to which your chosen procedures, your materials, your plan for data collection, and your plan for storing data and maintaining things like anonymity or confidentiality, you want the benefits to outweigh the risks. So what we do when we're doing this risk-benefit analysis is it's you, the researcher, who needs to make a subjective decision. Are the risks outweighing the benefits of this research that I'm designing? Are there ways that I can minimize the risks without harming the integrity of the research? Are there ways of improving the integrity of the research and its potential impact without exacerbating potential risks, and so on? So in order to think through whether or not a particular project should be conducted, that's the subjective decision you have to engage in. You have to assess what are the risks potentially, what are the benefits, and the benefits have to come out on the high side in order to go forward with the research. You have to think of many different categories of risk. Obviously, there's the risks to participants themselves. And there are lots of forms, and we'll talk about those a little bit more here in a minute. There are also societal risks to research that need to be managed. And by societal, I'm thinking of a particular example of research looking at, say, drug effectiveness. You're doing a trial on a potential new treatment. What if that medication that you try has the impact on unborn children of inducing birth defects? Well, long term, those children are going to require resources and that their needs be met. And therefore, you've incurred a specific cost, not only to your organization, but to society as a whole. And you've inflicted harm, not just on the individual participants, but on a wider circle of people in society. You also have to think about costs and benefits to you as the researcher and to your institution. So if you behave unethically, you open your institution up to litigation, and yourself, you're open to litigation. If you behave unethically in your research, you can get fired from your job, and you may suffer even broader consequences than that in terms of civil litigation. So the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself when you're doing this risk-benefit analysis is, number one, is it worth it for me to actually ask and answer this particular research question? And I know someone mentioned on perusal, wait, isn't any question worthwhile? Well, from a scientific perspective, no, not all questions are equal. In some cases, and I get into this debate with my seniors when they're tossing out ideas, things they might want to study for their SCE, they'll come up with an idea, they'll be kind of excited about it, and I have to be the super wet blanket and say, you know what? We do not need yet another eyewitness identification study that proves eyewitnesses suck. It's been done. It's been done to death. It's been overdone. And I respond the same way when students say, I really want to study birth order. And I'm like, no, it's been done. It doesn't really matter that much. Trust me, birth order makes very little difference. Just saying. So some questions just don't need to be answered. In other cases, a question might be fascinating, but utterly unanswerable. So there may not be technology that allows for the answer. There may not be any kind of even non-direct measures that allow you to answer the question. Or the risks of using a particular methodology far outweigh the potential benefits. If that's the case, then the research itself is not worth it. Like, for example, you may come to the question in your mind, what's the impact of exposure, birth to, say, age 5, of exposure to screen use? Well, if you wanted to do the perfect experiment, you'd get yourself a whole sample of brand new babies, and you'd randomly assign them to groups. And you would rigorously expose them to different levels of screen exposure. And ideally, you'd keep them in a laboratory setting where just their basic needs are met, and then you would expose them differentially to different levels of screen. And then, and you know, if this is sounding like a bad Lifetime movie, it should, you would need to equalize the behaviors of their caregivers. So they would have to all be cared for by the same cadre of people in the same environment, because you got to hold that constant. And then you would follow them over the course of those years, check their cognitive skills, check their language skills, check their behaviors, and so on. That would be the perfect experimental way to do that research. It's in no way ethical, period, to do the research that way. So ultimately, when you think about it in that way, the research idea is worth it, but conducting the research in the ideal experimental form is not. And in fact, it's just utterly immoral and unethical to do it that way. Other questions, obviously, you have to assess whether or not the benefits outweigh the risks. And it has to come out, the math has to come out that way for you to proceed. And you have to be able to show that with the methodologies that you've chosen, with the procedures you've identified, with the tools you've identified, can you produce valid and interpretable results? For example, last year I had a group of students who wanted to test the effectiveness of using a weighted blanket. Many of you have one of those, or you've tried one. The effectiveness of it for reducing subjective anxiety, but also a couple of different physiological measures of anxiety. So we had to make sure we carefully chose a subjective measure of anxiety. So we got a questionnaire tool that's been used very heavily in similar research, and it has very high reliability ratings and good construct validity. So there we had the subjective. These researchers wanted to use a physiological measure called heart rate variability. And we went out looking for some tools. I had read online that you could get a fingertip measure of heart rate variability, but I wanted to make sure that it was going to give us valid and reliable data to use in the study. So I did some research on this particular device, found where it had been used, how it had been used, and publications on its use. And that kind of background thing, you have to explain to the IRB members, this is the tool. We believe it will give us this kind of data, and that data will be interpreted in the following way. And if you come out on the side of saying, yep, this will measure what I say it's measuring, and this is a reliable tool for measuring that thing, then you are doing your due diligence. How do you determine risk when you're engaging in this risk-benefit analysis? You have to think about multiple kinds of risk. There, in some research, and I'm thinking in our exercise science program, they get this a little more heavily than we do over in psych and neuro. But you have to think about, are there any potential physical risks risks of injury? I'm remembering it's been several years since I've been on the IRB at Mount Union, but around the last year or so that I was on, there was one study where you had students had to jump. I don't know what the actual term for this is. You're flat-footed next to a box. You have to jump up both feet onto the box. There's probably a fancy name for it. But they had to do that repeatedly. And so in their IRB proposal at first, there was no kind of built-in procedure for how are you going to deal with what if someone falls? What if they injure, say, a knee or an ankle? If they hit the box wrong? There had to be protocols in place for weighing the potential risks. And potential participants had to be notified that there was a risk, and they had to decide mindfully, given that potential risk, did they want to participate. There are also psychological injuries that are potential, and we always have to think about this in our research, but I'm also thinking of another study that I vaguely remember. It wasn't my review, it was someone else on the committee, but there was someone in exercise science, and they were really looking at nutrition, a number of nutrition variables, but they were also assessing body image and self-esteem as kind of additional variables that they were looking at. And in that case, you have to think through, what is the potential that by thinking about these things, my participant may become upset, or they may become down on themselves. What kind of steps would I need to take to mitigate that risk, or to deal with it and provide support to that particular student? For myself, I've done research looking at mental health, both in student projects and SCEs, but also in my own research. So I always have to think about, what's the potential of exposing people to measures that really get them to think about their own psychological status and perhaps their trauma history or other events that they find emotionally evocative. So we have to think through, what are the potentials for mental or emotional stress, and how are we going to mitigate those? There are some kinds of research where you have to think about the potential for what's called social injury. And in some cases, there are some notorious examples of research that really failed on this count, where individuals were identifiable by name and identity, and they've been behaving in ways that were potentially illegal, or at least socially frowned upon ways. I've seen a handful of reports of social media studies that did a poor job of protecting the anonymity or ensuring confidentiality of examples from social media posts. And those are things where, let's say someone has posted incendiary remarks that have a racial tone to them, and you're a researcher and you're studying social media posts about race, and somehow the person who posted this one thing, you quote it, and it gets out who it was, and that person gets fired. That's an injury. Regardless of how unpleasant or racist the post was, you had a responsibility as a researcher to protect that person's identity, and you failed. That's a social injury to a person. It could be as light as they're embarrassed, or as severe as they suffer criminal penalties, civil penalties, lose their employment, and so on. Your responsibility as the researcher, you have to decide what are the risks, but you have to put it in the context of any potential participants' everyday life activities. So I kind of ask myself, is what I'm asking them to do, what the procedures that I'm asking them to go through, how does that differ from their regular everyday experiences? So for example, in the study, I think I described it earlier, a study of effects of television viewing on attitudes towards people with mental illness, I had participants watch TV shows. These were primetime programs that were not rated NSV or whatever. They were just regular mainstream crime dramas. So I had to say, if my college student participants, are they being exposed to media that is out of the range of what they normally watch, what they would normally be exposed to on television? And what I could say was, yes, these television programs are widely accessible, they're heavily viewed, they are not out of the range of the normal everyday activities of a student. Another example, we had students in one of my SCE groups some time ago. Students had to complete a number of trials of memory tasks, and in their IRB proposal, they argued successfully that completing these memory tasks was no more difficult and no less difficult than the types of quizzes and tests college students normally take on a regular basis. So the bottom line is that as researchers, we're obliged to protect our participants from any kind of stress, whether it's physical, social, or psychological, that they may incur as participants in our labs or in our studies. And you may be kind of calling on your memory here of some of the notorious social psychology studies that were likely referred to in your introductory psychology course, things like Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority study or Phillips and Bardo's Stanford prison study. Those are notorious examples for a reason. They were both those studies were conducted before we actually had functional IRBs who had oversight over non-medical research with human subjects. So both those studies were run kind of, just using in-house ethical oversight. And to be honest, most of the time that meant you, the researcher, kind of being counted on to be moral and ethical in your conduct. So there wasn't oversight. In some universities, there was local oversight, but it usually was at a departmental or university, a school within in a university at that level, as opposed to institutional. So those notorious studies, and many others like them, kind of prompted a decision on the part of colleges and universities and at the federal government level to say, it's not just medical research, it's got to be all research involving human participants. We have to do this right, and we have to have oversight because the potential for harm is actually great. Those two notorious examples, it's not been demonstrated. Well, there's a lot of folklore out there about Stanley Milgram causing his participants to become serial killers. That is an urban myth. There is no evidence whatsoever that is true. Same goes for the Zimbardo study. There's no evidence of harm that was long-standing or of the graphic nature that those who spin conspiracy theories would come up with. Regardless, though, ethical oversight would potentially have led to different procedures being employed in both of those studies. Now, one concept that comes up a lot in reviews of ethical considerations of our research is this concept of minimal risk. It's kind of our goal to have our participants be exposed to the minimum level of risk that would still permit us to collect our data and test our hypotheses without incurring any greater risk to those participants. So minimal risk means that the procedures or activities in the study are pretty much on par with or are less risky than the risks that people take in their regular everyday lives. So as I was describing with my video TV show study, watching primetime television programs that when they were aired on network TV aired at 9 p.m. There were rules about what content could be on at that hour. I could assure the IRB that for 18-plus-year-old adults that they are being exposed to programming that is well within the scope of their everyday experience. So that's what minimal risk refers to, and we're kind of, that's a goal for us to aim toward. Harm or discomfort in a minimal risk study can't be greater than that experienced in our everyday experiences or doing our routine activities. So I previously used the example of participants taking memory tests or doing memory tasks. That's very similar in terms of its rigorousness to what people would experience as college students taking quizzes and exams. And you can extend that kind of example across different domains. You do need to keep in mind, though, as a researcher, individuals will differ in what they can tolerate and what they've been exposed to. I did have a very, very tiny handful, I think a total of maybe 3 participants over a 3-year data collection cycle in my media study who, once they got through 1 or 2 scenes in the violent CSI episode that I was using in one of the experimental conditions, who just said, nope, too violent for me, I've never seen anything like that, and we asked them to stop their participation, or rather my research assistant did. So you have to remember that what's minimal risk to one person may not be minimal to another. So you have to build in protocols for what happens. So for example, in our informed consent procedure for that study, we indicated very clearly that they're, depending on their group assignment, they may be exposed to images of murder and potentially images of dead bodies. We also disclosed to them that they had a right to leave the experiment with no penalty at any time. So they still got their extra credit points or their credit for participating if they were required to by their introductory professor. If you, as the researcher, determine that the possibility of risk or of injury is more than minimal, then you have to consider that your participants are at risk as opposed to be minimally at risk. So the risk then has to be dealt with. You have to then establish what are your obligations to protect people in light of that elevated risk. The current news example, if people are considering joining a vaccine trial for COVID, for example, I'm guessing that the consent procedure is pretty rigorous, as are the bars that have to be met in order to meet the standards for inclusion in the study. So, and right now they're kind of one of the trials, the drug trials coming out of Cleveland, they're really looking for people who are at risk of contracting the virus and who are potential individuals who could have harmful outcomes. So they're looking for people with pre-existing conditions or who work in high-risk environments to be in the drug trial. So that's a case where, if you're looking at regular everyday life in the before times, being exposed to a vaccine for a virus that has possible negative outcomes and you're already an at-risk person, those researchers have to be extraordinarily careful to weigh the risks and benefits and to come up with contingencies and protocols that ensure complete informed consent and give participants some control over the process as they move through the research. So what are some ways that you deal with the risk? Because no piece of research is completely without risk. We can only go for, you're either at risk, and within that phrase at risk, there are some ranges, or you're at minimal risk. There's never no risk. You still have the responsibility regardless of protecting your participants. As the risk goes up, the safeguards have to become more stringent. And your potential longer-term relationship with your participants, it could be extended. Research activity that has more than minimal risk, shouldn't be done unless you can adequately and ethically mitigate the risks for people. And you have to show that you explored the potential value of lower risk procedural options. So for example, I'll go back to vaccine trials. You don't just start off with a vaccine trial with an at-risk population. You start with animal models. Then you start with testing safety in robust communities. Then you move up, then you go to the at-risk care individuals. in a vaccine trial, because those would be the first wave of people that you really want to protect with a vaccine. A key differentiation that you need to make as you're thinking about mitigating risk is the difference between anonymity and confidentiality. In our everyday speech, we sometimes conflate these two concepts, but they are handled differently. In some cases, if you want to protect participants from social risks, from things they may be fearful of, if their responses to, say, a questionnaire were made public with their name attached, is that you can guarantee that their responses are anonymous. And anonymity means you don't have access to their name or any other personally identifying information at all. So when I do a SurveyMonkey study and I ask people to fill out a questionnaire, if there's no reason for me to have their email or even their IP address or their name, I don't take it because I don't need it, and therefore I'm making participation anonymous. If you have to have an identifier, however, in some of our studies in the department, we have to be able to give extra credit, or maybe as an incentive to participate, you want to be able to put students' names in a raffle for a gift card or something like that. If you have a reason why you need identifiers, or just the most common in research out of our department is you have a two-stage experiment and you want people to participate at time one, and you want them then to participate again at time two. Well, you need to keep their identifiers connected so that you can connect their two timed pieces of data. Then you have to, that's no longer anonymous because you have to have a way of identifying people. Then you have to guarantee confidentiality. You have to prove how are you going to keep their identity secret from other people. So just to review, anonymity means that you are not recording any personally identifying information at all. Confidentiality, however, means that once you've got the data collected, you can replace, either remove completely or replace identifying information with a randomly assigned code to identify people. And it also means that you're going to present results in group statistics form so that no one can be identified individually. What this does is it ensures that responses are either anonymous or are confidentiality. It helps you because guaranteeing those things, if you're the researcher, guaranteeing those things to your potential participants, especially if you're dealing with sensitive topics or personal topics, it ensures that your participants feel safer, they feel more comfortable, and it's possible that they're more honest as a result. Now, I've mentioned informed consent a couple of times already, so we need to talk a little bit about what do we mean by informed consent. Now, if you're like me, you've probably been handed informed consent forms. Maybe you've had a surgical procedure. I remember when I had cataract surgery on one eye, it was a 15-page consent form, and I was frankly too tired to read all of it. Now, unfortunately, I'm not alone in my lack of tolerance for long legal-sounding documents. In our research, we usually have consent forms that are maybe a page and a half long, but there are certain elements that have to be guaranteed. We see the informed consent form as kind of a part of this this social contract between researcher and participant. We have an obligation to explain procedures clearly, to identify any things that potential participants might use to help them make a mindful decision whether they want to participate, and we have to guarantee that we'll be available to answer questions about the research that we're proposing to them. Participants have to be guaranteed the ability to leave the experiment at any time that they want without being penalized. So in an undergraduate environment, that means we still have to give them extra credit if they decide 2 minutes in that they want to stop participating because they're uncomfortable. We also can't pressure people. You know, I have this conversation with my seniors pretty much every year where they're recruiting subjects and they really want to recruit as many subjects as possible. So like, I'm going to tell my whole team that they have to participate. And I'm like, no, you won't. And they're like, why? And I said, ethics, that's pressuring people. You're using your social relationship with those people to pressure them into participating. And they sometimes come back and say, I'm not pressuring them, they're my friends. Well, because they are your friends, they feel normatively bound to say yes to you. So you may not recruit your friends. You have to do recruiting in a way that doesn't exploit those relationships. We also have the ethical obligation to avoid lying, cheating, and engaging in other kinds of fraud in order to encourage participation. You can't guarantee outcomes that are not going to be outcomes. Here's a simple example. I've had to ask seniors to revise their debriefing forms and their consent forms when they say things like, this research will benefit you by giving you information on your attitudes, beliefs, and values. Well, if you're talking about a group questionnaire where people fill out a questionnaire and they provide you with their data, 99.9% of the time, you are not going to give them individual feedback on their results. So telling them that they will be given individual results is dishonest. You're promising them an outcome that they're not going to get. So that's unethical. Informed consent has to be granted by or secured from a guardian if you are seeking participants who are children or who are in some way not capable of full and independent consent. And what this is called is informed assent. So if I want children as participants, anyone who's under 18, I have to seek out parents or guardians to get their permission. If you're talking about, let's say, someone who is disabled and has a brain injury, and you want them to be your participants, well, you have to seek out advice then on the degree to which the person's impairment actually impedes their capacity for consent. And if it's determined that they are not capable of independent consent, then you have to get consent from someone who has the power to do that, such as someone who has power of attorney for that individual. Researchers, when they are unclear, they need to consult with their IRB and other professionals who can give them an informed opinion about participation and the degree to which individuals can consent meaningfully to the research that's being proposed. And that includes research that might take place at a public forum. So let's say that you want to do research in a school and it's a middle school and you're proposing a field experiment. Now it's a public setting that creates some interesting, weird ethical gray areas in terms of consent. Public behavior is typically not something you require informed consent to be granted by individuals, but these are children. Is there a requirement for a blanket kind of a consent, and who gives that consent? Do the children give the consent, or do the adults give the consent? Do the principals give the consent? What about the school board? So those are situations where you really have to consult with your IRB and other local professionals to get their input on procedure. Settings like that, public settings, require some special decisions be made about protecting privacy. For example, when you're doing audio or video recording, there have to be ways of obscuring individual identifying information. If it's video, you have to find ways of obscuring facial features, aspects of clothing that are identifiable, if those videos are going to be shared with anyone else. So privacy refers to protecting individuals' rights to decide how their image or their voice is used, or other elements that they provide as data points to you as the researcher. Privacy, if we want to expand this idea, privacy rights for individuals, you have to think through these three basic dimensions to decide about what information needs to be protected under privacy. You have to think about the sensitivity of the information. Anytime you're dealing with private information that can potentially embarrass, can potentially expose someone to risk of getting into trouble, legally or otherwise, you have to really think about the sensitivity of it. You have to think about the setting and what kinds of risks of harm you might be exposing someone to if their information is disclosed. And you have to think about how you're going to share information about the research. So go back to the video idea. You may record video or audio. I've done this before in focus groups, for example. Once I created transcripts, however, and removed all personally identifying information from those transcripts, like names, I destroyed the videos. And that was disclosed in the informed consent form as a way of protecting privacy. So you have to really think through, as the researcher, how do I share this sensitive information about people or groups? And if I decide I'm going to do that without their permission, that's a serious violation of ethics. That's, like, in my world, working in academic science, that's a fireable offense when you engage in that kind of behavior. So that ends part one of our coverage of ethical issues in the conduct of psychological research.